Amateur Traveler is in its 20th year now, but can you imagine if I had people on the show who had never been to the destination, but had just read about it or seen a movie about it? That wouldn't make any sense at all, and you wouldn't listen. We all know how important it is to receive advice from people who know a destination to get the most authentic local experience. And a great option for experiencing this is Explore Worldwide and their authentic small group adventures, led by local tour leaders, perfect for solo travelers who want to meet like minded people with a desire for adventure. I'm often an independent traveler, but two of my last three trips were with small group tours because they organize everything and it's a lot easier. If you want to recreate the tour I did to Malta, they have a Malta and Gozo Discovery Tour. I'm intrigued by one of their tours called A Taste of Sicily. The company again is Explore Worldwide and visit exploreworldwide.com to learn more. And thanks to Explore Worldwide for sponsoring this episode of Amateur Traveler. The nights are long, the days are short, and the weather is chilly to downright cold, depending on where you are. It's a good time to slip into a Quince iconic Mongolian cashmere sweaters, which start at only $50. You can treat yourself to everyday luxury at an affordable price with Quince. If you really want to dive into luxury, you can check out their leather handbags, washable silk shirts, and European linen sheet sets. Whatever you're looking for at Quince, all the prices are 50 to 80% less than similar brands, and they do that by partnering directly with top factories and cutting out the middleman. They only work with factories that use safe, ethical, and responsible manufacturing processes. And of course, they use premium fabrics and finishes for that luxury feel in every piece. But you've already heard me rave about my Quince travel pants. Treat yourself this winter without the luxury price tag. Go to quince.com/traveler for 365-day returns plus free shipping on your order. That's QUINCE.com/traveler to get free shipping and 365-day returns. Quince.com/traveler. And thanks to Quince for sponsoring this episode of Amateur Traveler.
Got my bags packed, I'm on a roll. I'm heading out there, and I'm ready to go. Looking real good in my passport photo. Oh, no.
Amateur Traveler, episode 254. Today, the Amateur Traveler talks about barges and vineyards and castles as we cruise down the Rhine River.
Got to sit in one more cafe. I know that I should be heading home, but maybe not today.
Welcome to the Amateur Traveler. I'm your host, Chris Christensen. I don't have any news stories for this particular episode because I'm recording this a little bit ahead of time, so we're going to just go right into the interview, but it's no interview today, but instead I'm going to be telling you about a recent trip down the Rhine River on an Avalon cruise ship. And we'll just get the disclosure out of the way ahead of time. As you may recall, I had been, at least before I went to TripAdvisor, reselling Avalon cruises as part of reselling Globus tours. And this was a FAM trip that I went on, so it's a heavily discounted trip so that I could talk about it. And obviously we went on it because, one, they were giving us a discount, but two, because it was something that sounded interesting. And this particular cruise that we went down is again on the Rhine River from Basel to Amsterdam, and I'll be talking a little more detail as we go along about where we stopped. And it was called the Romantic Rhine trip. And if you want to follow along with this, you can go to amateurtraveler.com/Rhine to follow along with the particular itinerary we did, or you could also go to amateurtraveler.com/Avalon to see some of the other tours they do. And so we took this trip, and strangely enough, you don't fly into Basel because there aren't as good air connections to Basel, Switzerland. So instead you fly into Zurich is the way most people are getting to the cruise ship. And then a lot of people, as they flew in, did one of two day tours. They either did a day tour of Zurich or they did a day tour of Lucerne. But I did not. I actually stayed in the hotel and waited for my wife, who was flying in separately. I was flying in from Boston. She was flying in from San Jose. And one of the reasons for that is I'd actually been to Zurich. If you go back in the Amateur Traveler, you can see the episode about going to Zurich, Switzerland, I think 2 years ago. And we had spent about 3 days there during one of the, oh, it was 3 years ago because it was during Zurichfest, and Zurichfest only happens every 3 years, and it's a big festival in Zurich. Wonderful city, really love it, but didn't need to go see it again, especially in the rain, which is when we flew in. And so, first thing I talk about is weather. If you're going to do the kind of cruise that I did, the itinerary we did, I would recommend doing a little earlier in the year. It was a little cooler when we did it. So if you haven't seen these cruise ships that cruise down the rivers, they're very long and very thin. They're much smaller than a regular ocean-going cruise ship. I think the Avalon Luminary, which we were on, holds 160 passengers when it's full. And it's a little higher end cruise. I think this cruise would normally go next year. I think it sells for about $1,800 per person. And then you always have to remember that with cruise prices, as we've talked about before, you need to factor in your tips, which are about 15 euros per person per day on this one is what they recommend. And then also your side trips, your excursions. Now, this trip had a lot of built-in excursions, as we'll talk about, but that's something you need to think about as you're doing prices. So a little more expensive than the regular ocean-going cruise ship. Ocean-going cruise ship, discounted cheaper cruise, I would expect about $100 a day. This was about an 8-day cruise, so a little about twice that, I would say, roughly. But very nice ship, brand new ship. They had launched this ship in July, and we were taking it in October, so everything was very new. Although I was really surprised to learn that the oldest ship in their fleet is 4 years old, and they're about to retire it. So all of their ships are fairly new. What they're doing is they're leasing their ships, and they're only leasing them for 4 years. So again, cruise ship, long and thin. You got 3 decks for the cruise ship, and then a top sun deck. Because of when we went, we didn't get to use the sun deck all that much, and we were up on the sun deck as we were going through the Rhine River Gorge, which again we'll talk about in a minute. We were very bundled up because it was relatively cool up there. So if you wanted to do a Rhine River cruise, I would recommend doing it a little early in the year. Probably September would have been better, early September, after the big August rush would probably be better. So we started in Basel, as I said, so we took a bus from Zurich to Basel. We had bought the transfers, and the idea with the transfer is they meet you at the airport and get you to where you need to go. So we didn't really do anything in Basel on this particular tour. The first stop was the next day in Strasbourg. And Strasbourg I'd only been to briefly one time 23 years ago or so, and I really fell in love with Strasbourg. I really want to get back and spend a little more time there. As was the case in a lot of the ports for this particular cruise, there was an included walking tour of Strasbourg with the cruise. Those walking tours tended to be about an hour and a half with a local guide, not with somebody from the ship, but with somebody you're meeting there who knows Strasbourg. In this case, someone who speaks fluent both French and German, because Strasbourg is this region that has shifted back and forth in time, and so it is a portion of France, but as the name sounds like, for one thing, it's a very Germanic influenced area. It's an area as well known for its beer as its wine, and its wines are going to be your white wines. This whole region is a Rhinish or a Rhenish culture. So the whole area you're going to has been trading back and forth for years and years and years. And so there's a culture that is common along the cities on the Rhine. And so one of the things that's common is the type of wine that is more common here is a Rhine wine or a white wines. And Strasbourg is typical of that as well. Strasbourg is the capital of the Alsace region of France. Before that, it was the capital of the Alsace-Lorraine region of Germany, as I said. We did the day tour, walking tour of Strasbourg. Now, 2 things I should say about the walking tours. One is the people on the ship tend to be a little bit of an older crowd. So it's not uncommon to see somebody with a hearing aid or who needs hip surgery or something like that. And so the walking tours don't go very fast, and at least one person on our ship was in a wheelchair, and everybody pretty much was able to do the walking tours. So that's the good news, bad news. Obviously, you're going in a crowd of people, so that's a disadvantage. The guides were, I think, with one exception. We had one guide that we didn't really connect to, but most of the guides were just really did a very nice job. And then they had a device which I thought I was going to hate. As you left the ship, you took your headset, which they had left in your cabin. It was a one earbud. It went in your left earbud, I think. And then you got picked up a device which is a wireless transmitter that you put in your pocket. As you got off the boat, the guide started speaking, and you tuned in your guide. And it might not work. You might tune in the guide next to you. You'd have to unplug it, turn it on again, walk a little farther away, and then you tune in your guide. Now, you are on the same frequency as your guide, and you don't actually have to stay in that little clump of people that you're used to being with as you're going around in tour guides. So I found it really useful, for instance, as we went in the cathedral at Strasbourg. And the cathedral at Strasbourg is very beautiful. A number of the cathedrals in the area obviously were bombed out, so a lot of the stained glass was destroyed. Strasbourg, they had paneled up all the stained glass and they had put it away someplace safe, and then had restored it after the war. And so it was very pretty from that point of view. But our guide was sitting down with the group and she was talking. She was giving us the tour of everything about the cathedral. But I was walking around the cathedral. You couldn't even necessarily tell I was with that tour, but I was still getting a guided tour of the cathedral. If I took off my headset, she wasn't speaking very loud, so she wasn't being disruptive to people who were worshiping at the cathedral. So I actually found that I was surprisingly pleased with that device. And of course, if you were hard of hearing, it would make it easier because you had your own volume control and you didn't have to be right next to the guide. You could be in the back of the pack or wherever you needed to be. So that was an interesting experience. But we walked around Strasbourg. Strasbourg is a UNESCO World Heritage Site, and it has a lot of canals and rivers that create the island that is the old town, the Altstadt of Strasbourg. And so we started actually with a river cruise. We got on one of the river cruise boats that was actually large enough to take all the passengers from our boat. So it took 160 passengers or so, and cruised around as we learned about Strasbourg's history as well as its current association, for instance, with the United Nations, which is a very large presence in Strasbourg. Strasbourg is, as I said, a UNESCO World Heritage Site. A lot of the half-timbered buildings, so very Alsatian kind of look, and if you're familiar with that look, very Germanic kind of style, and just a very beautiful city. Again, I love beautiful cathedral. They still had the towers of an old bridge, like the bridge in Luzerne, if you're aware of that. Great big square towers, and then Luzerne still has a covered bridge in between them. They don't have that anymore at Strasbourg, but they still have those old towers. Still have a lot of buildings left over from the Middle Ages. I'll put some pictures in the enhanced version of this show, which will show you Strasbourg. The other thing that was interesting about being on a river cruise is you're closer to the city. Often when you get off on a big cruise ship, you're at a great big industrial port, and you're not any place in a neighborhood you necessarily would like to be, first of all. And so as you get to the city, you take buses, or maybe there's a cruise port there or something like that. But with the cruise ships, the river cruises, you're often tying up really close within walking distance of downtown. Now, Strasbourg, they did manage to give us a map that had the wrong location for the ship marked. And for those of us who read maps, we went to that location as we walked back, and we could have taken the bus back, but we had stayed in town a little longer and didn't find a ship there, so we did eventually find the ship. But again, within walking distance of downtown. I also like that when we opened up our great big windows for our cabin had a sliding glass door, actually, that you could actually literally walk out to the river if you wanted to. There was a guardrail there to keep you from doing that, but as we opened up our windows in the morning, there were swans floating by, just right there. And there are pictures of that up on the website as well. But just a very different experience from the closeness that you have. When you get to the city, you don't take it over. Now, there were a number of different cruise lines that do these sort of cruises that we would run into. Viking River Cruises, which has been a sponsor of the Amateur Traveler, was one that I noted. Everywhere we went, we would run into a Viking River ship, and there also were Amadeus, and then several other cruise lines that I wasn't familiar with. But a number of people doing these cruises, and so I would say in town, in Strasbourg, maybe there were 5 different cruise ships in town at the same time. In the afternoon, we had the afternoon to either explore Strasbourg on our own, which I really would have enjoyed doing, but we also took a tour out to the Alsatian region, and we went to one of the walled towns in the Alsace there, as well as out to a vineyard, and where we did some wine tasting. And I enjoyed, again, every excursion we did, I enjoyed. One guide I didn't connect with quite as much. But the disadvantage, you're in a big bus, they're driving you through a beautiful Alsatian walled town on the way to the one you're going to. And they're pointing out the tower, and they're pointing out the well, and look at the half-timbered buildings, and this section of town is about from the 1300s, and then as we go through another gate, this section is now from the 1200s. But we don't stop. Again, I'm used to being an independent traveler, and there's certainly places that I would have stopped on the way there, but there's only so much time. And so we did enjoy the tour that we did out to the Alsace, but also now I would love to go back and explore again on our own. We'd spent a wonderful day on the Rue de Vin, the wine route, which goes through the Alsatian region, the very eastern region of France, from Strasbourg or around Strasbourg all the way down towards Basel. Beautiful, beautiful drive with lots of castles and ruined castles from the 30 Years' War up on the hill. And again, a wonderful, gorgeous area. Flowers everywhere. The Alsatians were out in almost every square we went to, replacing the flowers with a flower that was more appropriate for the season or that was fresher. So beautiful half-timbered buildings, walled towns, towers, vineyards everywhere. Oh, and I said we had gone out to a little walled town, and that was Obernai. I didn't mention the name of the town. It's a fairly touristy town. We ran into a couple from the U.S. who were saying how wonderful it was to be here in the middle of nowhere in France. And any place that has a bus parking lot outside of town, outside the walls, is really not the middle of nowhere. If you're looking for the middle of nowhere, I would recommend checking out the town of Mutzig, which we went to. Now, we went to 23 years ago, and it was not quite on the tourist track, at least at that time. Again, another little lovely walled town, a lot of them in this area, because the 30 Years' War did really ravage this area. And so anything that's left probably was fairly well protected. Most of the trip was actually in Germany. I said we started in Switzerland and went to France. Our next stop was in Speyer, and Speyer is where the Neckar River joins the Rhine River. And the main reasons for stopping in Speyer was not Speyer itself. We did tour the town, and that was the tour that didn't really catch me as much. Speyer is a lovely town. I wouldn't go out of my way to see it necessarily. Cathedral is a beautiful Romanesque cathedral on the outside. The inside is fairly Spartan, and while I appreciate that from a religious point of view as a Protestant, for instance, I don't necessarily appreciate it as much as a photographer. So Speyer is lovely, but I wouldn't necessarily spend a lot of time there. But the reason you stop in Speyer is to do a half-day trip up to Heidelberg. And Heidelberg is a beautiful fortress city. The fortress was destroyed in the beginning of the 30 Years' War. In fact, the person who owned the fortress is one of the reasons for the start of the 30 Years' War. There was a German prince who lived in Heidelberg, and his father had built this great big fortress, and he tore down part of it to build nicer palaces for his wife, who happened to be of the House of Stuart in England. And he was elected by the nobles in Prague to be King of Bohemia. But because he was a Protestant, he really shouldn't have taken the job. Even his mother begged him not to take the job. But when he did, that started the 30 Years' War, the 30 Years' War between Protestants and Catholics that destroyed, I think they said 80% of the population of Germany were killed in that horrendous war, including, if you're in Prague, you can see there are monuments on the main square for these nobles who actually had elected him and then were killed shortly thereafter. The other interesting thing about this particular prince is that because he married into the English family, when England runs out of Protestant kings, they go over and get his descendants from Germany, who are the Hanoverian kings. The George the First is the first one. That is now the House of Windsor, the ruling house in England. So Heidelberg has this interesting connection with England and with Prague, where we had been, for instance, last year, and this kind of nexus point for the 30 Years' War, the beautiful ruined castle. The fortress is still quite stunning and quite large and very interesting to look at. Enjoyed the tour, a very engaging tour guide who was very knowledgeable about all of these things. And the town itself is beautiful. It is a university town, if you're not aware of that. It has a quite old university in Heidelberg still, so it isn't just an old town, but still very much a university town. Lots of young people running around, cobblestone streets. We went there on a rainy day, but still a very beautiful town. Love to get back and spend some more time in Heidelberg. The next stop was Mainz. Mainz, again, every place we went, they wanted us to tour the cathedral. Mainz was probably the cathedral I would skip first because it's dreary. It isn't just Spartan. It is really, we went there again on a little bit of a rainy day. Again, this is not the best weather to go there, but it's a dark cathedral. When they lost the stained glass windows in World War II, they replaced them with predominantly black and white windows, and The highlight of Mainz is definitely the Gutenberg Museum. Gutenberg was a native of Mainz, and so there's a wonderful museum there where they do show you how the Gutenberg press worked. They show you how the movable type that Gutenberg invented worked, and all the tour guides seem to have learned how to operate a Gutenberg printing press, which I thought was pretty cool. But we spent the other half of the day in Rudesheim, this beautiful small town surrounded by vineyards right there along the Rhine. The hills go up from the town up to these vineyards. There's a gondola that you can take up to a monument to German unification. So if you're not aware of German history, Germany was not one nation really until the 1800s. Really, many of the countries that we know of in Europe, Italy also wasn't its own nation until about that time period. Greece didn't get its independence until the 1800s. So really a lot of countries in Europe that we think of as current countries were either part of larger empires or, like Germany, were many individual city-states. So there's this great big monument on the top, and even if you're not a big fan of German unification, a wonderful view from there of all these vineyards and of this beautiful town. We went to a museum of, I want to say musical instruments, but it really was musical instruments that play themselves, so like player pianos, but some that, for instance, had violins and did whole orchestral sounds, as well as early gramophones and great big one-man band thing. It was really quite interesting. Quite a charming little museum and worth the trip. Although, again, as an independent traveler, the one thing they said, we're going to take the train up there, and I thought, oh no, this is going to be one of those little tourist trains. And indeed it was. We got off the boat. Our little bubble of English-speaking people. Most of the people on the boat were Americans, with just a scattering of people from Holland, England, Canada, and Australia. Definitely an English-speaking crowd, and you got into our little bubble of the tourist train and rode up the hill. But it is a hill, and for some of the people, that would have been a long walk. We walked back down again. It wasn't that far. I noticed at one point I overheard somebody on the boat saying, well, they said it was walking distance, but with them, that could be like a mile or two. And I'm thinking, yeah, okay, well, that sounds like walking distance to me. But again, it depends on what your walking distance is. And the crowd, I'd say quite a few people were retired age and up to the 80s or so. And so they took the little train up. Again, a lovely little museum. We explored around. Then we did take the gondola up. Not everybody did. That was something that we did on our own. And beautiful view of the barges going by on the river. North of Rudesheim, we went to the Rhine River Gorge, or we went through the Rhine River Gorge. This is another UNESCO World Heritage Site. It is a narrow place in the Rhine River where they're no longer allowed to build bridges because it is a UNESCO World Heritage Site. Number of castles or ruined castles as you're sailing by. Some of the more beautiful castles, including one castle, for instance, that almost was like a ship in the middle of the river. This castle has a prow, and these castles were obviously built there to get money from the people who were trading up and down the river, mostly trading down the river. You would build your barge, you would sail it downstream, and then you would take it apart and use it to build houses in Amsterdam because you didn't have the technology at the time to power a barge back upstream. And so the barges tended to go from Switzerland to Amsterdam, and then the goods were sailing in that direction as well. So you would use it to get your goods to market. And along the way, you'd come across these castles, and they'd say, well, that's very fine that you're taking your goods to market, but you are required to either pay us taxes, or sometimes you'd be required to sell your goods in town for 2 days on your way to market to make sure that this town got a cut of your goods. And so some castles here in this region, again, beautiful vineyards in the sides, and we had our most clear, beautiful, sunny day as we're sailing through this region, which was just the perfect time to have good weather if we were going to have good weather. And so check out the pictures that I have on the website if you're not watching the enhanced version of the Rhine River Gorge. And I'd say that is the real jewel of this particular cruise. You can do a one-day cruise, probably from Koblenz, which is the next stop we did before we got to Köln, of the Rhine River Gorge, that might work better for some of you who don't want to do the entire cruise. Again, that's the jewel on this particular cruise. We did stop in Koblenz. Not a lot to say about Koblenz. We did a walking tour. It was nice, but again, Rhine River Gorge was the real highlight of that day. The next stop was Köln or Cologne, depending on who's in charge and whether you're using the French or the German. It is a German city, and the German pronunciation for the city is Köln. The main reason to see Köln is the cathedral there. And we're a little tired, as I said, of cathedrals at this point because the one in Speyer and the one in Mainz really were ones that I would skip. But I would not skip the cathedral in Köln because it is breathtaking. It is large. It is one of the largest cathedrals in Europe. Just towering, massive, dark cathedral with very intricate carvings on the cathedral. And large inside as well. We can climb the tower of the cathedral in Cologne, which we did. It's 523 steps to the top. Now, my wife and I have this tradition of if they tell us there's something tall and you can climb it, we want to do that. So we did. We climbed the cathedral, and the view from the cathedral itself wasn't actually as terrific as I would like to tell you it was. One, we had a little bit of rainy weather again, as we did on a number of the different days, but also you're in the prettiest building in town. So your view is of the rest of town, which has a few other older buildings, but a lot of more modern buildings as well. Köln was very heavily damaged in World War II. The cathedral was less damaged. It was used basically as a landmark by the bombers and was one of the reasons it wasn't as heavily damaged. But still, I thought worth the climb. Now, we were with at least one person on the tour who couldn't do the climb to the top because it was too claustrophobic. Because this is one of these narrow, medieval, winding stone staircases. If you get claustrophobic, this is not for you. If you have bad knees, this is also not for you. But for us, it was something we could say we did, and it was a challenge. The other thing I would check out in Köln is the Museum of Roman History, which is right next to the cathedral. They have some large mosaics there that were tiled floors from Roman villas in the area, as well as a number of different funerary statues. And then from Köln, we sailed up north to Amsterdam through the Rhine River Canal to get to Amsterdam. Amsterdam is not directly on the Rhine, but it is these days accessible via the canal. Amsterdam is an interesting city. It was the very first place that my wife and I went in Europe 23 years ago. Now, Amsterdam, as you know, has quite the reputation, the red light district, and being very laissez-faire about their drug laws, and being a little more rough and tumble city, perhaps. And so we were actually intimidated by it 23 years ago. I don't really know why now. I'd have to say it's kind of funny to me that we were intimidated by Amsterdam. It's a beautiful city. It has, as I'm sure you know, canals. It has a ring of has about 4 rings of canals around the medieval area. And so the medieval city is within the first canal or two. And then the train station is just spectacular building. It's huge. We didn't get to the Anne Frank house, which is one of the more popular attractions there. There's a line around the block for that. You can get tickets online. If you do want to visit that, I would suggest you get your tickets online and not stand in the line around the block there. We did a canal cruise through Amsterdam, which was very enjoyable. Going through all the different little canals and looking at the buildings. And one of the interesting things about the buildings in Amsterdam is they do have this hook up at the attic level that they used to use to get their goods up into the attic, which was the storehouse. But they still use it these days. I guess it's quite common if you're walking by and somebody's moving into their apartment to see a couch hanging from the hook, or to see a couch hanging outside a window. They said that it won't fit through because someone forgot to measure correctly, which I thought was an interesting view into the life in Amsterdam. Bicycles everywhere, just amazing tons of bicycles. By the train station especially, there are parking lots that are just a sea of bicycles. I guess it's quite common that you'll come out and not find your bicycle there because bicycles are stolen quite often. So most of the bikes are old bikes because you don't want to have something that's new, which is a little sad. And then along the canals are also these barges or canal boats or houseboats, a number of different styles, the old canal boat style or some newer ones which have a concrete foundation that people are living in, that started as squatters. It started as people who couldn't afford to get a house, and nowadays it's more popular, so some of them are quite upscale as well. The houses in Amsterdam very thin and narrow, although some of them now, people have taken multiple different houses and turned them into a hotel or into a business or something like that. But you were taxed based on your square footage in the ground floor, and so you had these tall, thin buildings that you didn't have to pay as much tax for. All the buildings are stone. There aren't very many wooden buildings left over because of the tremendous fire hazard. The city burned down a number of different times, but you see all the interesting cornices of the buildings. There's about 5 different types of roof lines, all very steep because of all the rain that this city does get. And it was, of course, raining while we were there. Again, we saw a fair amount of wet weather while we were there. That's the sights that we saw. The ship itself, as I said, fairly new. We ate a lot of meals on the ship. The ship service was very good. I'd say the food was good. Certainly nothing to complain about. You had enough variety to choose from. You had about 6 different options for dinner. The ship doesn't have as many amenities, obviously, as a big ocean-going ship. So it has a lounge in the back, a small lounge, a big lounge in the front that would hold everybody from the ship, the dining room, a really tiny workout room that had maybe a room for a treadmill and a fitness bike. I think probably the only other room would have been a beauty shop. So you don't have the climbing wall, you don't have the indoor skating rink or the movie theater, you don't have theatrical performances on the scale that you would have in an ocean-going ship. So if that's what you're looking for, this is not for you. This is really more a way to wake up in a different city, to be able to just walk off the ship if you want to. You don't have to do any of the tours that they want and enjoy this particular region. I get now why river cruising is more popular. I did enjoy it. Again, it goes a little bit against my independent traveling nature, but we did enjoy it. We did enjoy the people on the boat. We did enjoy the places we went. As I said, we also enjoyed the tours. Oh, and I should say the third UNESCO World Heritage Site we did see is the Old Town in Amsterdam was recently also declared a UNESCO World Heritage Site. So anyway, that was my Rhine River tour. And for more information about Avalon, again, amateurtraveler.com/Avalon. And for more information about the Romantic Rhine Tour, amateurtraveler.com/Rhine. And again, I would encourage you also to check out Viking River Cruise, which has been a faithful sponsor of this show before I took all the ads off the site. I'm going to skip news from the community this week, not because I don't have any, but because I need to pack, because tomorrow night we're heading to Egypt for the Amateur Traveler photo tour. So if you have any questions about this show, feel free to leave a comment on this show at amateurtraveler.com or send me an email to host@amateurtraveler.com. Again, you can also follow me on Twitter at Chris2X. And as always, thanks so much for listening.